There is a country that exists in two places at once. The first is a landscape so staggering in its scale, so unreasonable in its beauty, that travelers who reached it centuries ago never quite found the words. Mountains that pierce the sky at angles that seem structurally impossible. Valleys so green and so still that the silence inside them feels intentional, as if the land itself decided long ago that no sound belonged there. Rivers that run cold and clear through gorges carved over millennia, carrying meltwater from peaks that have never been named by anyone still living. Deserts that shift color through the day, moving from pale gold at dawn to something closer to rust by the time the last light falls. This country has all of it, simultaneously, in a space smaller than Texas. The second place this country exists is in the mind of the world, and there it is something else entirely. In that second place, it is a word more than a geography, a conflict more than a landscape, a problem more than a civilization. The world has held this image for so long and pressed it so firmly into the public consciousness that the first place, the actual place, has become almost inaccessible. Not because the roads are gone, though some are. Not because the mountains are impassable, though some are that too. But because the image has become the territory. And once that happens, the actual territory stops mattering to almost everyone. This is a documentary about Afghanistan, not the war, not the politics, not the sequence of foreign powers that arrived with certainty and left with questions. Those things exist, and they will appear here because they are inseparable from the land and the people. But this is not a documentary about what happened to Afghanistan. It is a documentary about what Afghanistan is. What it has always been, underneath everything that has been placed on top of it. And what it is this, one of the most extraordinary places on Earth, possibly the most consequential crossroads in human history. A geography so demanding that it shaped not just the people who lived inside it, but every empire that ever tried to cross it. A civilization so old and so layered that to stand in certain parts of it is to stand inside several thousand years of continuous human memory. The world refuses to see this. Or rather, the world has decided, perhaps unconsciously, that the image it holds is sufficient, that Afghanistan has been explained, that it has been processed and categorized and filed, that further looking is unnecessary. This documentary is a refusal of that decision. We are going to look, carefully, slowly, without rushing toward conclusions. We are going to move through this country the way you move through something you genuinely want to understand, which is to say, without deciding in advance what you will find. Start with the shape of the land because in Afghanistan, more than almost anywhere else, the land is the explanation for everything else. Afghanistan sits at the center of Asia in a way that looks, on a map, almost architectural, as if something placed it there deliberately. To the north, the great flatlands of Central Asia, the steppes and plains that have historically served as corridors for migrations of people moving in every direction. To the south, the Indian subcontinent, pressing upward from below. To the east, the narrowing passage toward China. To the west, the Iranian plateau and beyond it, the ancient world of Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. Afghanistan is the hinge between all of these regions, the point at which they press against each other. And at the center of Afghanistan, determining everything, is the Hindu Kush. The Hindu Kush is not a mountain range in the way that most people understand mountain ranges. It is not a single spine of peaks running in one direction. It is more like a system. A mass of connected ridgelines and valleys and passes that occupies the center and the east of the country, and effectively divides everything into distinct worlds. North of the Hindu Kush, the land flattens toward the Amu Darya River and the steppes of Central Asia. South of it, the land drops toward Kandahar and the arid plains that eventually become Pakistan. The Hindu Kush is not just a geographic feature, it is a mechanism. It has, for thousands of years, controlled movement, controlled trade, controlled which armies could go where and which could not. The name itself carries something. Hindu Kush. The translation most commonly given is killer of Hindus, a reference, historians believe, to the mortality rate among slaves and travelers attempting to cross its passes in winter. Whether or not that etymology is precise, the name communicates something real about the range's character. It is not hospitable. It is not neutral. It is a landscape that actively imposes itself on everything that enters it. And yet, people have been crossing it for thousands of years. Because the passes, though brutal, exist, and where passes exist through an otherwise impenetrable range at the center of a continent, commerce and culture and armies will always eventually find them. The Khyber Pass is the most famous. Running between Afghanistan and Pakistan through the Spin Gar Mountains at the southeastern edge of the country, it has been crossed by Alexander the Great, by Babur, by British armies twice, by Soviet convoys, by refugees. Its walls have been inscribed with the names of regiments. It is one of the few places on Earth where you can look at a physical piece of landscape and trace through it the entire arc of civilizational contact between East and West. It is not a beautiful pass, particularly. It is narrow and brown and austere. But it carries inside it more human history than almost any comparable stretch of geography anywhere in the world. This is the first thing to understand about Afghanistan. Its geography is not background. It is not context. It is the subject. Everything else, the empires, the cultures, the conflicts, grows directly from the shape of this land. Move north of the Hindu Kush, and the character of the country changes in ways that feel almost like crossing a border into a different world. The Amu Darya, the ancient Oxus, forms the northern boundary of Afghanistan, separating it from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. This river has been a boundary for so long that it appears in Greek sources, in Chinese accounts, in Persian poetry. Alexander crossed it. The Mongols crossed it. Timur crossed it. The Amu Darya is not just a river, it is a threshold. And the land south of it in the Afghan north is a landscape that does not match most people's image of Afghanistan at all. The northern plains of Afghanistan, particularly around the city of Mazar-i-Sharif, are agricultural, productive. In spring, they are covered in wildflowers in fields of wheat and cotton and, historically, opium poppies. The light here is different from the light in the mountains. It is broader, more horizontal. The sky sits lower. The pace of the land is slower. If you arrived here knowing nothing about where you were, you might think you were somewhere in the Fertile Crescent or in the agricultural heartlands of Persia. You would not necessarily think you were in Afghanistan, as most people imagine it. Mazar-i-Sharif itself is built around a shrine. The Mosque of Hazrat Ali, also called the Blue Mosque, is one of the most visually extraordinary religious structures in the Islamic world. Its domes are covered in tiles of blue and turquoise that, in certain light, seem to generate their own luminescence. Thousands of white pigeons live around its courtyards. The pigeons are considered sacred. According to local belief, any gray or black pigeon that comes to the shrine will turn white within 40 days. This is not metaphor. People believe it as fact. The birds have been there for centuries. They are part of the atmosphere of the place, part of its continuous life. The shrine is believed to be the tomb of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. This belief is contested by other parts of the Islamic world, which place Ali's tomb in Najaf, in Iraq. But the claim here is ancient and is held with a certainty that does not invite debate. For Shia Muslims across Central Asia, Mazar-i-Sharif is sacred in a way that goes beyond ordinary religious significance. It is a point of gravity, a place where the spiritual weight of history has been accumulating for over 1,000 years. To stand outside that mosque at dawn, when the tiles are catching the first light, and the pigeons are moving through the cool air, and the call to prayer is threading through the streets of the city, is to be inside something that has very little to do with the Afghanistan that exists in the minds of people who have never been here. It is to be inside a civilization, one that has been practicing its rituals and maintaining its sacred places through everything that history has thrown at it. This is the second thing to understand. Afghanistan is not a failed civilization. It is a surviving one, and those are different things. The distinction matters because it changes the question. If Afghanistan is a failed civilization, the question is, what went wrong? If it is a surviving civilization, the question is, how has it survived? And that second question, pursued seriously, leads somewhere far more interesting. To pursue it, you have to go further into the geography, because the geography is still the explanation. The Wakhan Corridor is one of the strangest pieces of land on Earth. It is a narrow strip of territory, in places no more than 15 kilometers wide, that extends eastward from the main body of Afghanistan like a finger pointing toward China. It was created in 1893, not by geography, not by culture, not by any logic internal to the land itself, but by the competing anxieties of two empires. Britain controlling India to the south, and Russia, expanding through Central Asia to the north, needed a buffer between their respective spheres of influence. Afghanistan, which had no say in the negotiation, was shaped to provide it. The Wakhan Corridor was drawn into existence by men sitting in rooms in London and St. Petersburg who had, in most cases, never seen the land they were dividing. The result is a place that belongs to Afghanistan administratively, and to almost nothing else in any other sense. The people who live in the Wakhan are Wakhi and Kyrgyz, distinct ethnic groups with languages and customs that connect them more directly to Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan than to Kabul. The land itself is extraordinary. The corridor runs along the upper reaches of the Panj River, with the Pamir Mountains rising on both sides to heights above 7,000 meters. The sky in the Wakhan is different from the sky almost anywhere else. It is higher somehow, colder and more absolute, as if the air itself has been refined by the altitude into something purer and more indifferent than ordinary atmosphere. In summer, Kyrgyz nomads move their herds of yak and sheep through the high meadows of the Little Pamir, following routes that their families have used for centuries. They live in yurts. They navigate by landmarks that have no names on any map produced outside the region. They exist in a relationship with this landscape that is so old and so precisely calibrated to its demands that it constitutes in itself a form of knowledge. Not the kind of knowledge that gets written down, the kind that gets carried in the body, in the hands, in the memory of how a particular valley smells when the weather is about to change. These communities have almost no contact with the Afghan state. The road into the Wakhan from the rest of Afghanistan is difficult in summer and impassable in winter. There is no consistent infrastructure. There is no reliable communication. In practical terms, the people of the Wakhan Corridor live outside the systems that most people mean when they say the word country. And yet here they are, inside Afghanistan's borders, maintaining a way of life that predates those borders by centuries and will, most likely, outlast whatever political arrangement currently holds them. The Wakhan forces a question that the rest of Afghanistan also forces, but more quietly. What do borders actually contain? What is a country when the land inside it is this various, this internally different, this resistant to any single description? Afghanistan has been called ungovernable so many times that the word has become a kind of shorthand. But ungovernable by whom, and according to which model of governance? The Kyrgyz nomads of the Little Pamir are not ungovernable. They are governed, extremely precisely, by the demands of their landscape. They have developed over centuries a set of social structures, conflict resolution mechanisms, and resource management systems that allow dozens of families to share a small and demanding territory without destroying it or each other. That is governance. It simply does not look like anything that originates in a capital city. This is a pattern that repeats itself across Afghanistan. The country is not a single political unit that happens to contain geographic variety. It is a collection of distinct ecological and cultural worlds that have been placed, by the accidents of imperial cartography, inside a single set of lines. And the tension between those worlds and those lines is one of the oldest ongoing stories in this part of Asia. Come down from the Wakhan and move west, through the high valleys of Badakhshan province, and the landscape shifts again. Badakhshan is in many ways the most remote and the most preserved part of Afghanistan. Its capital, Faizabad, sits at the confluence of the Kaksha and Kandahar rivers, surrounded by mountains on every side. The roads that reach it are roads in the loosest sense. They are tracks cut along riversides, clinging to cliff faces, crossing rivers at fords that change character with every season. To reach many parts of Badakhshan requires not just time but a specific kind of willingness, a willingness to enter a landscape that does not accommodate urgency. Badakhshan is where lapis lazuli comes from. This is not a minor geographical footnote. Lapis lazuli, the deep blue semi-precious stone that colored the robes of Byzantine emperors and the pigment of Renaissance paintings and the grave goods of Egyptian pharaohs, has been mined in Badakhshan for over 6,000 years. The mines at Sari-Sang, high in the Kaksha River Valley, are the oldest continuously operated mines in the world. 6,000 years. To hold that number for a moment. 6,000 years ago, the people of this valley were extracting stone from this mountain and trading it across a network that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Nile. They were connected to the ancient Mediterranean world not by roads that anyone would recognize as such, but by desire. By the human desire for a specific shade of blue that existed, in sufficient quality and quantity, only here. The lapis lazuli trade routes were among the earliest long-distance trading networks in human history. They predated the Silk Road. They predated most of what we call civilization. And they ran through Badakhshan, through this remote and mountains-locked province that the world currently describes, if it describes it at all, as inaccessible. The stone is still being mined. The methods have changed somewhat, but the mine at Sari-Sang is still active. Blue stone is still being pulled from the same mountain where it was pulled 6,000 years ago, still being sold, still moving through networks of trade toward places that value it. There is something in this continuity that resists easy interpretation. It is not triumph, exactly. It is not tragedy. It is something quieter. The persistence of a relationship between a people and their land that has survived everything time has placed between then and now. Move west from Badakhshan and the altitude drops. The valleys widen. The rivers grow slower and broader. You enter the geography of Kunduz province, the agricultural north, where the land remembers a different history. Kunduz sits near the ancient trade routes that connected Balkh, once one of the greatest cities in the world, with the passes of the Hindu Kush and the road south toward India. The soil here is deep and fertile. The growing season is long by Afghan standards. For much of its history, this was productive, prosperous land. Balkh itself is the reason to pause here. Because Balkh is one of those places that almost no one in the contemporary world thinks about, and almost every part of the ancient world did. Balkh is today a small, quiet town in northern Afghanistan, about 20 kilometers from Mazar-i-Sharif. It sits in a flat plain surrounded by remnants of ancient walls. From the road, it looks modest, unremarkable even. But the ground beneath and around it is layered with the residue of several thousand years of continuous urban life, making it one of the oldest cities on Earth, and once, by any measure, one of the most significant. The Greeks knew it as Bactra, and made it the capital of their Bactrian kingdom after Alexander passed through. The Zoroastrians considered it among their holiest cities, and there is scholarly argument that Zoroaster himself was born in or near Balkh, which would make it the origin point of one of the world's oldest monotheistic traditions. The Buddhists built monasteries here. The Kushans made it a center of their empire, the empire that connected Rome and China through trade and transmitted Buddhist ideas across Central Asia toward East Asia. The Arabs brought Islam. The Persian poets came. Rumi was born here in Balkh in 1207. The poet whose verses have been translated into more languages than almost any other writer in history, whose lines about love and longing and the divine are read today on every continent, was born in this quiet town in northern Afghanistan that almost nobody visits and almost nobody mentions. Balkh was destroyed by the Mongols in 1220 with a thoroughness that contemporaries described as absolute. The historian and traveler Yaqut al-Hamawi visited shortly before the Mongol arrival and described a city of great learning and beauty. Ibn Battuta visited a century after the destruction and described ruins and emptiness. That gap between Yaqut's description and Ibn Battuta's represents one of the great cultural catastrophes in human history. A city that had been continuously inhabited and continuously significant for perhaps 4,000 years was, within a period of months, reduced to rubble and silence. And yet Balkh survived. Not as what it was, but as something. People came back. The walls were partially rebuilt. The trade routes, somewhat altered, resumed. The memory of what the city had been was maintained in texts, in poetry, in the way people spoke about the place. Balkh continued to exist, diminished but continuous from that moment to this one. This is the pattern again, the surviving civilization, the thing that persists not through triumph but through an almost biological insistence on continuity. Afghanistan has been at the center of more civilizational collisions than almost anywhere else on Earth. It has been conquered by Greeks, by Marians, by Kushans, by Sassanids, by Arabs, by Ghaznavids, by Ghurids, by Mongols, by Timurids, by Moguls, by Safavids, by Duranis, by British, by Soviets, by Americans. Each of these arrivals brought destruction or transformation or both. And each time, something survived. Something persisted in the valleys and the villages and the high places that was not destroyed because it was not, finally, the kind of thing that can be destroyed by an army. What persists is harder to name than a city or a dynasty. It is more like a relationship between people and landscape, between communities and their particular places, between the living and the enormous weight of the dead. who lived in the same valleys and crossed the same passes and looked at the same mountains before them, moved south from Balkh, crossed the Hindu Kush through the Salang Pass, and the world changes in a way that feels less like travel and more like transformation. The Salang Pass sits at 3,878 meters above sea level. The road through it, the Salang Highway, was built by the Soviet Union in the 1960s as part of a program of infrastructure investment that was, like most things the Soviets did in Afghanistan, simultaneously genuinely useful and strategically motivated. The tunnel at the top of the pass, the Salang Tunnel, runs for nearly 2.5 kilometers through solid rock. When it was completed in 1964, it was the highest road tunnel in the world. It cut the travel time between Kabul and the north from days to hours. It connected two worlds that geography had kept partially separated for millennia. To drive through the Salang is to feel the mountain pressing in from every side. The tunnel is narrow. The ventilation, always inadequate, fills the air with exhaust. In winter, avalanches close both approaches with regularity, sometimes for days, sometimes longer. People have died in the tunnel from carbon monoxide poisoning when convoys stalled inside it and the engines kept running. The pass above it is one of the most dangerous stretches of road in the world during the winter months. Trucks sometimes queue for days on both sides, waiting for the road to reopen, the drivers sleeping in their cabs in temperatures that fall well below zero. And yet it never stops. The traffic through the Salang never fully stops because the connection it provides is too necessary. The north feeds the south with wheat and cotton. The south sends manufactured goods north. The road is the artery. And like all arteries, its blockage, even temporary, is felt throughout the system. On the southern side of the pass, the landscape opens in a different direction. The descent toward Kabul is through valleys that narrow and then widen, through small settlements built against the cliff faces, through rivers that run fast and cold from the snowmelt above. The scale is immense but also intimate somehow. The mountains are close. They are always close in this part of the country. They frame everything. They give every view a boundary, a limit, a sense that what exists within them is contained and particular and separate from everything beyond. Kabul appears gradually. First the city's outskirts, spreading up the lower slopes of the surrounding hills. Then the density increasing. Then the city itself, sitting in a bowl at 1,800 meters altitude, ringed on all sides by mountains that rise sharply from the edges of the urban fabric. Kabul is one of the highest capital cities in the world. The air is thin. The winters are brutal. The summers are dry and bright and surprisingly cool by the standards of the region. What Kabul is, underneath everything that has happened to it, is an ancient city that has been at the center of Asian history for a very long time. There are traces of human habitation in the Kabul Valley going back at least 3,500 years. The city itself, as an urban entity, has existed in some form for at least 2,000. It was part of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. It was visited by Alexander. It was the eastern capital of the Safarid dynasty. It was ruled by the Ghaznavids, by the Ghurids, by the Timurids. Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, loved Kabul more than any other place he ruled. He spent years here, wrote about it in his memoir with a specificity and affection that survives translation into pure feeling. He asked to be buried here, not in India, not in Samarkand, not in any of the other great cities he controlled. Here, in Kabul, in the garden he planted on the hillside above the city. His tomb is still there. The garden, Bagh-i-Babur, has been restored. It is still a place of quiet and of trees, and of a particular quality of afternoon light that Babur described in his memoir 5 centuries ago, and that, remarkably, still reads as accurate to those who have seen it. That is the quality of Kabul that gets lost in every contemporary account, not the violence which is real, not the poverty which is real, not the political dysfunction which is real, but the depth of the place, the sheer depth of it. The sense that you are standing in a location that has mattered, continuously and significantly, for an amount of time that exceeds the entire history of most of the world's cities. The city sits at the confluence of several of the most important trade and invasion routes in Central Asian history. The road east toward the Khyber Pass and India, the road north toward the Salang and Central Asia, the road west toward Herat and Persia, the road south toward Kandahar, and the routes into the subcontinent through Balochistan. Every one of these roads has been traveled by armies and merchants and pilgrims and refugees for thousands of years. Kabul is where they converge. It is the point at which the geography of Central Asia becomes most legible, most concentrated, most visible as a system. And the city reflects this history in its architecture, in its language, in the diversity of its population. Kabul is a Pashtun city and a Tajik city, and a Hazara city, and a Uzbek city, and a Sikh city historically, and a Jewish city historically, and a city where at certain moments in certain centuries, all of these communities existed simultaneously in a proximity that was sometimes tense and sometimes generative and always interesting. The old city of Kabul, Shari Kona, though much of it has been damaged or destroyed, still contains in its street patterns and its remaining buildings the evidence of this complexity. The bazaars still operate in modified form. The logic of the city, the way it moves and trades and argues and rests, is still recognizable to anyone who knows how to read cities of this type and age. What Kabul is not, has never been, is a Western city. And one of the recurring tragedies of its recent history is the attempt, repeated by different powers in different centuries, to make it into one, to reorganize it according to principles that have nothing to do with its geography, its history, or the instincts of the people who built it and live in it. The city resists this not through ideology, but through something more fundamental, through the sheer mass of what it already is. There is a neighborhood in Kabul called Murad Khani that survived the worst of the city's recent damage in a form that allows you to see what the old city looked like. Narrow lanes, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. Wooden balconies projecting over the street, intricately carved in patterns that are distinctly Central Asian, connected to the decorative traditions of Samarkand and Bukhara and Herat. Courtyard houses, turned inward, presenting blank walls to the street and reserving their grace and their light for the interior. This inward architecture is not defensive in the modern sense. It is cultural. It reflects a particular way of organizing the relationship between public and private life, between the world outside and the world within, that is very old and very precise and very specific to this part of Asia. Murad Khani has been partially restored by Afghan and international preservation efforts. Walking through, it is walking through a layer of the city that most visitors, in those periods when visitors came, never found. It requires slowness. It requires the willingness to be lost in a place where the street grid does not follow any legible logic. And in that lostness, something becomes available. A sense of the city as it was built to be experienced, not as spectacle, not as destination, as place. As the particular kind of place that only very old cities, cities that were built by people who intended to live in them rather than display them, ever fully become. South and west of Kabul, the land changes character again. The mountains give way to a high plateau, and the plateau gives way to the broad plains that extend toward Kandahar. This is Pashtun Heartland. The geography here is austere in a way that is different from the austerity of the mountains. The mountains are austere through excess, through the overwhelming scale of what they impose. The plains south of Kabul are austere through reduction, through the stripping away of almost everything until what remains is sky and dust, and the occasional line of poplars marking a watercourse, and the low shapes of chalets, the traditional fortified family compounds that dot the landscape in patterns that look from above. Like the scattered evidence of some ancient and ongoing argument with emptiness. The chalet is the basic unit of settlement across much of rural Afghanistan. It is not simply a house. It is a defensive and social structure simultaneously. High mud walls, thick enough to provide insulation against the extreme temperatures and sufficient resistance against projectiles of various kinds, enclose a compound that typically contains multiple generations of a single family or clan. The entry is controlled. The interior is subdivided according to the rules of hospitality and privacy that govern Pashtun social life. There is almost always a separate reception room, the hujra, for male guests, connected to the outside world by its own entrance, allowing strangers to be received and housed and fed without entering the private spaces of the family. The chalet is a self-sufficient unit in a way that few architectural forms anywhere in the world still are. It stores food. It houses animals. It contains workshops. It can, in extremity, function as a small fortress. This is not accident. It is the architectural expression of a social logic developed over centuries in a landscape where the state, whatever state existed at any given moment, was at best unreliable and at worst actively predatory. In that landscape, the family compound is not primitive. It is rational. It is the correct architectural response to a specific set of conditions, and those conditions have remained sufficiently consistent over a long enough period that the form has persisted essentially unchanged for centuries. Kandahar itself sits at the center of this landscape like a city that has decided, definitively, what it is and has no intention of reconsidering. It is the second largest city in Afghanistan. It is the historical heartland of the Pashtuns, and by extension, of the Durrani dynasty that unified Afghanistan in 1747 under Ahmed Shah Durrani, the man most Afghans consider the father of their nation. Ahmed Shah is buried in Kandahar. His tomb, the shrine of the cloak of the Prophet, is one of the most sacred sites in Afghanistan. The blue-tiled dome rises above the city as a statement of continuity, connecting the present to a particular moment of political and cultural formation that still organizes much of how Afghans understand themselves. Kandahar is a city of immense historical depth and, at the same time, a city of extraordinary contemporary difficulty. The two things coexist in a way that is uncomfortable to hold in mind simultaneously, but that must be held if the place is to be understood honestly. It has been at the center of conflict for decades. It has also been continuously inhabited for over 3,000 years. It was a major city in the Achaemenid Empire. Alexander founded or renamed it. The Mauryan Emperor Ashoka left rock edicts here, inscriptions in Greek and Aramaic promoting Buddhist principles of nonviolence and governance, the westernmost evidence of Ashoka's imperial reach, sitting in the landscape outside a city that most of the contemporary world associates exclusively with the Taliban. Those rock edicts are still there. They sit in a hillside outside the city. the inscriptions worn by time but still legible to those who know how to read them. 2,300 years old. Carved by order of an emperor in India, who wanted even the most distant edges of his territory to understand that governance could be conducted according to principles of compassion rather than fear. Whether those principles were actually implemented in Kandahar in 250 BCE is a separate question. But the fact of the inscription, the fact that someone thought it important enough to carve these words into this stone in this place, says something about what Kandahar was in the ancient world. A place significant enough to be addressed directly by one of the most powerful rulers in human history. West of Kandahar, the land moves toward the desert. The Registan, the great sand desert of southern Afghanistan, spreads across the border regions with Pakistan. It is not the dramatic dune desert of popular imagination, mostly. It is flatter, harder, more relentless. A landscape of gravel and sparse vegetation, and a wind that moves without interruption across distances so large that it accumulates force in the way that water accumulates force in a river, channeled and pressurized by the sheer extent of open space available to it. The Registan has its own logic, its own inhabitants, its own history. Balak and Brahui communities have navigated it for centuries, using a knowledge of wells and seasonal watercourses and wind patterns that is not written anywhere and cannot be learned from any source except the landscape itself, and the people who carry its knowledge in direct transmission from generation to generation. These communities exist in the desert the way the Kyrgyz exist in the Pamirs, in a relationship so long and so precise that it has the character of mutual adaptation. The people have changed to fit the desert, and the desert, in small ways, has changed to fit the people. Push further west toward Herat, and the desert gives way gradually to something else. Herat is where Afghanistan becomes Persia, not in any political sense. The border with Iran is clearly drawn and firmly enforced on maps and at checkpoints. But in the deeper sense, in the sense of aesthetic tradition and architectural language, and the particular quality of urban civilization that expresses itself through gardens and poetry, and the proportions of a doorway, Herat belongs to the Persian world as completely and as naturally as Isfahan or Shiraz. It always has, and this belonging is not a recent affiliation or a political choice. It is a consequence of geography and of the slow accumulation of centuries of cultural exchange across a landscape that has never recognized the borders drawn through it as final. The city sits in the Hari-Rud River Valley, a broad and fertile corridor running east-west through the mountains of western Afghanistan. The river gives the valley its character. It is greener here than almost anywhere else in this part of the country. The light is different, softer and more golden than the hard light of the south. The air carries moisture from the river and from the irrigation systems that have been directing water through this valley for at least 2,000 years. Herat is, in the most literal sense, a garden city. It was built around the possibility of cultivation, and cultivation has shaped everything about it, including the way its people think about beauty and order and the proper relationship between human life and the natural world. The Timurid period is the moment that Herat most completely became itself. In the 15th century, under the rule of Shah Rukh and his son Ulugh Beg, and then most completely under Sultan Hussein Bey Kara, Herat was one of the most sophisticated cities on earth. The court at Herat was a center of miniature painting, of poetry, of music, of philosophy, of scientific inquiry. The poet Jami lived here, one of the last great classical Persian poets, whose work synthesizes Sufi mysticism with the full technical resources of the Persian literary tradition. The painter Kamal ud-Din Bayezid worked here, producing miniatures of such precision and psychological depth that they are still studied by artists and historians as among the highest achievements of Islamic visual art. The scholar and statesman Alisher Navoy worked here, writing in both Persian and Chagatai Turkic, effectively creating the literary tradition of what would become Uzbek literature, doing it in Herat, in the court of Sultan Hüseyin Bey Kara, who was his lifelong friend. The concentration of talent in 15th century Herat is one of those historical phenomena that is difficult to explain and impossible to dismiss. Something happened here that produced, within a relatively short period, an extraordinary density of artistic and intellectual achievement. The city was, by contemporary accounts, physically magnificent. Gardens, fountains, libraries, mosques, madrasas, caravanserais built on a scale and to a standard that drew travelers from across the Islamic world. Ibn Arhabsha visited. Babur visited and wrote about it with a reverence he extended to almost nothing else. The Venetian ambassador Giosafat Barbaro passed through and sent back accounts that astonished his readers in Europe. Almost none of the physical Herat of that period survives. The Uzbek conquest, subsequent conflicts, earthquakes, and the ordinary erosion of centuries have reduced the Timurid city to fragments. What remains is enough to suggest the whole, but only to those who know how to read architectural fragments the way you read a language from its remaining vocabulary. The Musella complex, the great religious and educational complex built by Queen Gaharshad in the early 15th century, once comprised dozens of structures. Today, 5 minarets remain standing, leaning at angles that suggest the slow negotiation between their mass and the earth beneath them. They are covered in geometric tilework, in patterns of blue and turquoise and white that are faded now but still legible as the remnants of an extraordinary decorative program. The minarets stand in an open field at the edge of the modern city, surrounded by nothing, stripped of their context, which makes them both more visible and more poignant than they would be if the rest of the complex still surrounded them. To stand among those minarets in the late afternoon is to feel the presence of an absence, not a vague or sentimental absence, a specific one, the absence of the city that was here and is not here anymore, the library that Gaharshad endowed, the madrasa where scholars from across Central Asia came to study, the mosque whose proportions were, by all accounts, among the most harmonious ever achieved in the Persian architectural tradition. These things existed. People walked through them, studied in them, prayed in them, argued in them, fell in love near them, died within sight of them. And then they were gone. And what remains are 5 tilted minarets in a field, and the knowledge of what they once belonged to. The old city of Herat, the historic core, survived better than the Musella complex. The bazaar, which has been in continuous operation for centuries, still follows the cruciform layout of a traditional Persian char suk, 4 covered market streets intersecting at a central domed space. The goods have changed. The noise and the density and the particular smell of a Central Asian bazaar have not. The citadel, the Kala Ikhtiyaruddin, rebuilt multiple times over its long history but retaining its basic form, still stands on its mound at the edge of the old city, a structure of such mass and such simplicity that it seems less built than grown from the earth beneath it. Its mud brick walls restored in the 1970s, and again more recently, glow orange in the evening light, in a way that is very specifically beautiful, in a way that has nothing to do with grandeur, and everything to do with the relationship between this particular material and this particular light at this particular time of day. The Friday Mosque of Herat, the Masjid-i-Jami, is perhaps the most important surviving monument of Afghan architectural history. It has been rebuilt and expanded many times over its 12th-century existence, and what stands today is primarily the result of Timurid and later reconstruction. But the building communicates through its sheer, accumulated presence, a quality that transcends any single period of its construction. The interior courtyard, lined with iwans of extraordinary tilework, with a pool at its center and light entering from above in ways that change through the day, is one of the great architectural interiors of the Islamic world. This is not hyperbole. Architectural historians who have spent their careers studying comparable structures in Isfahan and Samarkand and Istanbul place the Friday Mosque of Herat in the same conversation, in the same register of achievement. Almost nobody talks about it. Almost nobody writes about it in the general press. Almost nobody includes it in lists of the world's great architectural monuments. Because it is in Herat, which is in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan has been processed and filed under a different category, the category of problem rather than civilization, and monuments in that category do not receive the attention they would receive if they were located elsewhere. This is one of the quieter injustices of the past several decades, not the most important injustice, but a real one. The systematic removal of Afghanistan from the conversation about human cultural achievement has consequences that extend beyond the merely aesthetic. It affects how people understand what Afghanistan is, what Afghans are. It makes it easier to think of the country purely as a theater of conflict, as a geography of difficulty, rather than as a civilization with a history of extraordinary richness and a present that is, beneath the conflict, still continuous with that history. The people of Herat still recite poetry in the classical Persian tradition. There are families in this city who have maintained, across generations and across enormous disruption, the knowledge of how to work with specific artistic techniques, miniature painting, carpet weaving, tile cutting, that reach directly back to the Timurid period. This knowledge is not museum knowledge. It is not academic knowledge. It is practical knowledge, held in hands and passed between generations in the traditional way, through direct apprenticeship, through years of watching and doing rather than reading and studying. A carpet woven in Herat today, by a weaver who learned from her mother who learned from her mother, carries inside it a lineage of technical knowledge and aesthetic judgment that is 500 years old at minimum. The pattern language used in Herati carpets, the distinctive gull, the floral medallion, the particular color relationships, these are not inventions of the contemporary market. They are the accumulated decisions of generations of weavers, each one making small adjustments, small refinements, passing the whole forward to the next person in a chain so long that its beginning is not recoverable. This is what a living cultural tradition looks like. Not a performance of the past for the benefit of observers. A continuous practice that has adapted to every change in its circumstances while maintaining its essential character. Herat's artistic traditions have survived the Uzbek conquest, the Safavid occupation, the Durrani unification, the British interventions, the Soviet war, the Civil War of the 1990s, and the Taliban periods. They have survived all of it, not unchanged. Changed, adjusted, compressed in some periods and expanded in others, but continuous. The question that Herat raises, that it raises simply by existing in the way it exists, is the same question that Balkh raises, and that the Wakhan raises, and that the Blue Mosque in Mazar-i-Sharif raises. How does a civilization maintain itself across this much disruption? What is the mechanism? What is the thing that carries forward through periods when carrying forward seems almost impossible? Part of the answer is the landscape. The Hari-Rud Valley is productive. It feeds people. A landscape that feeds people creates the conditions for the kind of settled, continuous life in which traditions can accumulate and be passed on. The mountains around Herat have historically provided a degree of protection from the worst of the disruptions that have moved through the broader region. The geography creates a kind of shelter, imperfect and sometimes violated but real. But geography is not the whole answer. Because the Mongols reached Herat, they destroyed it in 1221, killed an enormous proportion of its population, left it, by contemporary accounts, a city of corpses. And yet within a generation, people were coming back. Within 2 generations, the city was functional again. Within 2 centuries, it was producing the greatest flowering of Persian court culture since the Samanids. The other part of the answer is something in the social structure of the communities themselves. Something in the way Afghan communities, across their enormous internal diversity, organize the transmission of knowledge and practice between generations. The family as institution, the craft guild as institution, the religious school as institution, the oral tradition as institution. These structures are redundant in the best sense. If one fails, another carries what needs to be carried. They are distributed, not centralized. They do not depend on a state or a court or a single patron to function. They can survive the collapse of states and courts and patronage because they were never fully dependent on them. This distributed resilience is one of the least understood and most important features of Afghan civilization. It looks, from outside, like decentralization, like the absence of the kind of unified social structure that makes a country legible to outside observers. And in political terms, it creates genuine difficulties. A society organized this way is hard to govern from a center, because the center has never been where the real organizational logic resided. But this same quality that makes Afghanistan difficult to govern from a capital city also makes it extraordinarily resistant to the kind of total disruption that has destroyed more centralized civilizations when their centers collapsed. When the court at Herat fell, the weavers kept weaving. When the library burned, the poets kept memorizing. When the roads became impassable, the traders found other routes or waited patiently for conditions to change. This patience is not passivity. It is a long-calibrated understanding of how change actually moves through systems as complex and as old as this one. It moves slowly. It meets resistance. It passes. And the thing that was there before, changed but recognizable, is still there after. Move north of Herat, up through the mountains toward Bad Guys Province, and the landscape becomes the color of old bone. The hills are bare and rounded, smoothed by wind over geological time into shapes that seem almost deliberate, almost designed, though the designer, if there was one, was working on a scale and a timeline that makes human intentionality seem beside the point. The light in Bad Guys is extraordinary, in that particular way that light becomes extraordinary when there is nothing to interrupt it. No trees, very few structures, just the rolling hills and the sky, and the light moving across both with a slowness that makes you aware of time in a different way than you usually are. This northwestern corner of Afghanistan is where the pistachio forests grow. They are not forests in the sense that most people mean the word. They are open woodlands, the trees spaced widely, their canopy thin. Their growth shaped by centuries of grazing and harvesting into forms that are gnarled and ancient-looking and specific to this landscape, in a way that makes them seem like they grew here, and nowhere else could ever have produced them. The pistachio trees of Badghis and Faryab provinces are some of the oldest in the world. Some of the individual trees are estimated to be several hundred years old. They have been harvested by the same communities for generations, following a system of customary rites and rotational harvesting that prevented overexploitation for centuries. And that, in periods of breakdown, when those customary systems stop functioning, visibly suffers. The pistachios from these forests were once traded across Central Asia and into the Persian world and beyond. They are still harvested, still traded. The continuity here is not romantic. It is economic and ecological simultaneously. A relationship between people and a specific plant in a specific landscape that has persisted because it works, because it provides something that people need, and because the people who do it have historically understood that maintaining the system that produces the resource is more important than maximizing the extraction of the resource in any single season. That understanding, that long-view relationship with the productive capacity of a landscape, is one of the things that gets lost when traditional resource management systems collapse under the pressure of conflict or poverty, or the imposition of external economic logics that don't recognize the value of what they're replacing. Afghanistan's landscapes are full of these relationships between people and specific places, specific plants, specific water sources, specific migration routes. The country is not, has never been, the empty or purely hostile geography that it appears to be in accounts that see only the conflict and the difficulty. It is a densely inhabited landscape, inhabited not just physically but culturally and ecologically, with systems of knowledge and practice that represent an enormous accumulation of human understanding about how to live in these specific conditions. That knowledge is among the most endangered things in Afghanistan today. More endangered in some ways than the physical monuments, because a monument, however damaged, leaves evidence of its existence. A body of traditional ecological knowledge, once the generation that holds it is gone, leaves almost nothing. It does not appear in archives. It does not survive in libraries. It exists only in practice, only in the doing of it, and when the doing stops, it is gone in a way that is genuinely irreversible. This is one of the things that the long disruption of Afghan life has cost that almost nobody counts. Not in the tallies of conflict, not in the assessments of damage, the loss of knowledge. The breaking of chains of transmission that connected the living to the accumulated understanding of hundreds of generations of people who worked out, through trial and error and careful observation, how to live well in one of the most demanding landscapes on Earth. And yet, the chains have not all broken. The transmission has not entirely stopped. In the valleys and the villages, in the workshops of Herat and the nomadic camps of the Kush and the pistachio orchards of Badghis, something is still being passed forward, imperfectly, under pressure, with losses that are real and significant, but forward. That forward motion, that insistence on continuity even under conditions that make continuity seem impossible, is the deepest story of this country. Deeper than any political narrative, deeper than any account of conflict or intervention or collapse. It is the story of a civilization that has been for most of its history at the center of the most consequential processes of human exchange and transformation, and that has survived all of it not by being impervious to change, but by being, in some fundamental and not fully explicable way, impossible to finally conclude. Afghanistan has not been concluded. That is the most important thing to understand about it. Every power that has arrived here with the intention of producing a conclusion has left without one. The Greeks left. The Mongols left. The British left twice, the Soviets left, the Americans left, the land remained, the people remained. The valleys and the passes and the rivers and the ancient cities layered with the residue of every civilization that has ever called this place home remained. And in those places, in the early morning when the light comes over the Hindu Kush and fills the valleys with a gold that has no comparison anywhere, when the call to prayer rises from 1,000 villages simultaneously, and the sound carries through the cold air with a clarity that seems almost architectural. When the rivers run with snowmelt and the poplar trees along the banks are the particular shade of green that they are only in spring, in those moments Afghanistan is simply what it has always been underneath everything that has been placed on top of it. One of the most beautiful places on earth, one of the oldest continuous human stories, a civilization that the world, for reasons that say more about the world than about Afghanistan, has decided it does not need to see. The world is wrong about that. It has been wrong about it for a long time, and the cost of that wrongness is paid not by the world, which continues without significant consequence, but by the people who live inside the image that the world has decided is sufficient, who exist in their actual complexity and depth and humanity behind a picture that was taken of them during their worst moments and then held up permanently as the complete truth of what they are. They are more than that. The land is more than that. The history is more than that. To look at Afghanistan seriously, slowly, without the predetermined conclusions that make looking feel unnecessary, is to encounter something that most people who have encountered it never fully recover from. Not because it is overwhelming in the way that spectacle overwhelms, but because it is deep in the way that only very old things that have been accumulating meaning for thousands of years in the same place, are deep. It stays with you. The blue mosque at dawn, the minarets of Herat in evening light, the silence of the Wakhan at altitude, the carved wooden balconies of Murad Khani, the sound of a language that has been spoken in these mountains for 2,000 years, the face of a place that has seen everything and is still here, still itself, still carrying forward the enormous and irreplaceable weight of what it is and what it has always been. The world can keep its image. Afghanistan will keep its mountains.